The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. I want to talk to you a little bit about him and life during that time before we get into the actual story. He was born in 1783 and died in 1859, and he was named after George Washington. He became the first American fiction writer to achieve an international reputation, and this says a lot about him because in that time it was a lot more difficult to connect with people in other countries, unlike today when we have the internet and things like that, where we can connect with someone from Asia or South America in the stroke of a key stroke on the computer or your phone. He was born to a wealthy family in New York, and he had originally planned to be a lawyer, but as he grew older, he decided, that he was more interested in writing and traveling. Now, of course, like any story or novel that we read, we need some background information. And this is important because when we're looking at these characters, it's hard to understand their choices and their actions if we don't understand the culture in which they grew up. So, life in the 19th century or the 1800s, and this is when this story takes place, it was following the Civil War, and so the United States became an industrial giant. That means people became more wealthy. They were working more, making more money because of railroads. And things like that. The industrial growth transformed American society. It produced a new class of wealthy industrialists and a prosperous middle class. Before this time, it was really just, you were either exceedingly rich or exceedingly poor. But now came this, middle class, and that's what most of us are here in our little town. This is, we are not necessarily poor, although some may be, but we're also not millionaires either. We're middle class, we're hard workers, and we make a good living. And that's what was booming during this time. Not everyone shared the economic prosperity of this period, though. Many workers were typically employed at least one part of the year, and their wages were relatively low. And the reason I want you to understand this new growth of wealth is because it plays a very important role as greed, and it is one of the main topics that we'll see and themes that we'll touch on in The Devil and Tom Walker. So let's get started. The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. This story appeared in 1824 when the American economy was booming. Advances in technology and transportation and the rapid growth of cities created large markets for goods, and for the first time, manufactured items were widely available and people had money to buy them. Irving's story tells the European tale of Faust, a scholar who sold his soul for wisdom. Tom Walker, Washington Irving's American Faust, has no interest in wisdom. He's simply after riches. Irving may have set the story in earlier America, but he revealed the materialism of his own era. Now, remember when we talked about this, about all the celebrities that it's rumored who have done the same thing that this character has done. So this isn't very far-fetched, as greed can have a major role in people's choices and what they will do to get that. A few miles from Boston in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay, and terminating in the thickly wooded swamp of morass. On one side of this inlet, in a beautiful dark grove, and the opposite side of the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge, on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age an immense size. Under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, there was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good look-out to be kept that no one was in that hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this is well known. He always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill gotten. So we have this treasure that is supposed to be guarded by the devil himself. And what does it mean by when he says, when as he does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill gotten? Ill means sick or bad, right? So if it's gotten in a, if you've gotten this treasure in a bad way, that's when, they say that the devil keeps his eye on it, when you don't get it in an honest way. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged for a pirate. About the year 1727, just as the time that the earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself, or we might use the word today, miserable. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect the secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. Many times when you have a husband and wife, what you have is shared. Your groceries especially, you don't say, this is my milk, you can't have it, get your own milk. Usually when you have a family, especially, between the husband and wife, even if you don't have kids, there are certain things that are shared. You might have your money and I have my money, but when it comes to certain household items, we would assume that they'd be shared, yeah? Otherwise, it would just be a lot of nonsense, and this seems to be what's going on with Tom Walker and his wife. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling, savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney. No travel stopped at its door. A miserable horse whose ribs were as articulate as the bars of a gridiron, stacked about a field where a thin carpet of moss, scarcely covering the ragged beds of the puddling stone, tantalized and balked his hunger. And sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, looking piteously at the passerby, and seem to petition deliverance from the land of famine. So even his crops wouldn't grow. Even he couldn't even grow anything in his yard. His plants wouldn't grow, whatever he planted to eat. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom's wife was a tall termagant, and if we look down here, that means a quarrelsome woman. Quarrelsome, what does that mean? That means somebody wants to fight. Women like that, the ones that everything you say to her, she's going to have an attitude and she's ready to fight about it. This is how Tom's wife was. Fierce of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm, her voice was often heard in wordy warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs that their conflicts were not confined to words. What does that mean? She had big arms, and if I come in and your face can tell me that you've been in more than just a word fight, that means you've got bruises on your face, right? If you come in with a black eye or a busted lip, most of the time that means you've been in a fight, right? And so his wife's kind of beating him up here. No one ventured, however, to intervene between them. The lonely wayfarer shrunk thin himself at the horrid clamor, and clamor clawing eyed the din of discord askance and hurried on his way, rejoicing if a bachelor in his celibacy. So he would run from her as if he were single. He would try to act like he was single. He had a terrible wife. One day that Tom Walker had been to a distant part of the neighborhood. He took what he considered a shortcut homeward through the swamp. Like most shortcuts, it was an ill-chosen route. The swamp was thickly grown with great gloomy pines and hemlocks, some of them 90 feet high, which made it dark at noonday, and a retreat for all the owls in the neighborhood. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and mosses, where the green surface often betrayed the traveler into a gulf of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the abodes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, where the trunks of pines and hemlocks lay half drowned, half rotting, looking like alligators sleeping in the mire. This is pretty bad piece of the forest he's going through here. I mean, looks like it's somewhere the alligators and snakes and bullfrogs would be. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to step anywhere where an alligator might be sleeping. Tom had long been picking his way cautiously through his treacherous forest, stepping from tuft to tuft of rushes and roots, which afford precarious footholds among deep sloughs, or pacing carefully like a cat along the prostrate trunks of trees, startling now and then by the sudden screaming of the bittern, or the quacking of a wild duck rising on the wing from some solitary pool. At length he arrived at the piece of firm ground which ran out like a peninsula into the deep bosom of the swamp. It had been one of those strongholds of the Indians during their wars with the first colonists. Here they had thrown up a kind of fort, which they had looked upon as almost impregnable, and had used as a place of refuge for their squaws and children. So he's finding this old Indian fort, and had used as a place of refuge. Nothing remained of the old Indian fort but a few embankments gradually sinking in the level of the surrounding earth, and already overgrown in part by oaks and other forest trees. The foliage of each formed a contrast to the dark pines and the hemlocks of the swamp.